Welcome to the Kill the Line podcast. It's me, Cody Clarke. We got a great show for you today. One of my oldest friends in filmmaking, Greg DeLiso, he's the director of Hectic Knife. He's making Psycho Ape 2 with Addison. If you just listened to the last episode, he made Psycho Ape with Addison. They're making Psycho 2 together. They raised over $10,000 to make that movie, Psycho Ape 2, and I think it's going to be great. I love Psycho Ape. I love Hectic Knife. I love Greg. So let's talk to Greg DeLiso. By the way, if you like the show, KillTheLionFilms.com. $2 per month. That's all we're asking. It keeps the show afloat. It keeps the studio afloat. We want to keep making movies and great podcasts for you. And now, Greg DeLiso. All right, Greg, good to have you on the show.
Yeah, man. Good to be here. First time, long time. Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So Greg is one of my oldest friends in filmmaking. He was right there with me making my first film, Shredder. He was on set for that, and we were both Brooklyn filmmakers back then. He's of course from Michigan, but at that time we were both Brooklyn filmmakers. What can you remember about that time period? That kind of like first decade of 2000s into, I guess, second decade of 2000s. Probably, I think we met probably around 2008 or 2009. What can you remember about that time making movies in Brooklyn?
I always forget that I'm in Shredder too, and then someone reminds me or it comes up somehow, and then I always remember that I pretended to not know how to play like Greensleeves or something. I think it's Greensleeves, something like that, on the guitar during that show. Yeah, man, it was fun. I mean, I don't know. God, Brooklyn in the late 2000s. I remember the fact that Pete and I were friends at the time. We're not now, but we were making all these shorts, and I had no idea because I hadn't seen it, but I had no idea that we were making films and later shot a ton of stuff for Hectic Knife in exactly the same locations that they were shooting Saturday Night Fever. And if you watch Saturday Night Fever, which I finally did about 2 years ago, Jason's is actually visible in it. There's this store, I don't know if it's still there, but there's a store in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn called Jason's, but the way the sign was, it looked like it was called Jason's. And we thought that was funny. And yeah, there's a bunch of locations there's like the bridge by like 100th Street in Bay Ridge. Like we used to hang out there all the time and just shoot scenes with Craigslist actors and stuff. And it was really fun. And then I was watching Saturday Night Fever and they were in the same spot. So I remember walking around Brooklyn in that area and just shooting a bunch of funny stuff and going over to your house and helping you film stuff. And yeah, it was an interesting time. I don't remember a lot of the films, honestly, from that period. That's sort of when I started to like check out of like what was going on with like real movies just in some ways. But I don't know. I try to stay in touch, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I feel like that was kind of when mumblecore was like kind of taking over the public consciousness as far as like when an independent movie was. And we kind of fell like outside of that, and we were trying to figure out what we were doing, because we were more, I think, influenced by stuff like Stella and David Wayne. And also like when I made my first movie, I was thinking like, oh, you make your first movie, it's got to be in black and white. And I was thinking more in terms of like making like a 16 millimeter film, like a Jim Jarmusch movie or like Clerks or something like that. So we had these different frames of reference where like, you know, I'll talk to younger filmmakers now who are just starting out and they just don't have the same kind of thoughts going through their head whatsoever. They just think in terms of YouTube, and they think in terms of, you know, yeah, I have the latest DSLR camera, or yeah, I have whatever. And it's just not a consideration as much. But I was very hyper conscious of like what was out there, what I didn't want to be at the time, what I wanted to do, finding myself, dealing with the fact that like there was things I wanted to do humor wise, and there was things I wanted to do drama wise. So Woody Allen was like really huge for me at that time period, because he was the one person I could kind of point to out there who had kind of conquered comedy and tragedy at the same time. So that was what was going through my head. I have fond memories of Bay Ridge. I was there just probably about a week ago. I remember I walked by your old apartment and I snapped a picture for you. And it's always going to be Bay Ridge. Like, it was pretty much the exact same vibe there. Not too much has changed. I enjoyed being around there. It was a good time. And like you said, Saturday Night Fever, I love that movie. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's pretty underrated as far as like a movie goes. Like,
No, I definitely like it. Yeah, I definitely like it. I didn't know that it sort of was shot and took place in my old neighborhood. I mean, I say my old neighborhood. It was, I lived there from like 2005 to like 2011 or something. But no, I mean, yeah, it's all shot right there, and it's really incredible to see that. I mean, yeah, thank you for sending that picture. I mean, hearing you talk about the black and white first film, I mean, I think about that a lot. I talk about that concept with people. It's certainly a bygone thing. I mean, to my understanding, and I could be somewhat wrong about this, but to my understanding, there was this notion when you were shooting on film, and when shooting on film was kind of like the thing that existed, because we're before the consumer video era. So we're talking basically around the year 2000 and before that. So the last century. The black and white first film was based on this idea that black and white film was just cheaper to buy. And so a movie like Clark's could have been in color, but let's pretend that would have cost an extra, few $1,000s in film costs. So they just decide to do black and white. I could be wrong. Sometimes people like to tell stories like that to kind of make them sound more cool than they are. But it seems to, regardless of the real reason, I was going to say it seems to, it definitely was something that essentially almost became a trope. It happened so often. It seemed like every one of my favorite filmmakers had these earliest films or first films that were black and white. Everybody from Kubrick to Spike Lee to Scorsese to, Gus Van Sant, to just all those big, kind of 80s, 90s, 2000s indie guys. That was such a thing. And I sometimes, for myself, I don't know if you feel this way ever, but I always kind of laugh to myself about being a young person and emulating that idea, because it was so important to me that Hector Knight was like in black and white and stuff. And, it's, I mean, if it really is true that it was done out of necessity because of what they could afford, then there's a certain funny, like, pretentiousness to that idea of like copying that on video. Because I shot like Hackett Knife in color. I just made it black and white, and it's just sort of like, it's a cheat code to feeling like you have this, in with all the camaraderie, with all these people shooting on film in a way. But I never cared about any sort of like all this, the noise between like shooting on film and video and stuff. And, I wanted like that to have like a certain specific black and white look. I really emulated the look of Pi with the high contrast, like Tri-X reversal, 16 millimeter stock stuff that he was doing with that. But when you talk about mumblecore too, I mean, mumblecore is something that comes up with me a lot in conversation as well, because very interestingly, I sort of reflect on the idea that you and I were young people in our early 20s living in Brooklyn, only a few neighborhoods, you even closer, but only a few neighborhoods away from really what I would say is kind of the last big like film, like underground or independent like film movement that sort of brought a few people very famously like into the popular mainstream. I mean, obviously Barbie is coming out, like soon or whatever. I honestly, it sounds like you may have some differing, and it'd be interesting to kind of talk about this a little bit, but some differing thought on it. But I think obviously Hectic Knife, there's not really much mumblecore about it as far as the aesthetic. But I always regretted, as I got older, I regret not making myself somehow more connected to that scene, because it sounds kind of crazy, but somehow or other, I kind of knew it was happening kind of all around me. But this is only for me personally. I feel like you might disagree or we might differ on this, but I felt personally like too in my own little cave and sort of like insecure to just like go find these people and become a part of this little scene. And I regret doing that, because I had no idea at the time that it was going to foster like people in such a big way. But, it felt like my opportunity as a young person to be part of like a movement that was happening in film that happened to be localized right in my backyard, and I just didn't take any advantage of it. And I sort of look back on that time now, and I wonder. I don't really know exactly what the current movement is, or what's next, or what's kind of going on, and I feel kind of disconnected from that stuff in some ways. And so mumblecore, I mean, it's a lot more expansive than just like the puppy chair and a couple other things. I mean, there's just like so many different little, branches on that tree. And I also think something interesting about mumblecore is that I don't think it's nearly as known as like to us it is. I mean, we grew up around it, but there's like people who are really into film and really into all the sort of different offshoots of underground filmmaking and indie filmmaking throughout the last 125 years are certainly aware of it and into it, but I don't think it had nearly the cultural power or anything of anything like we saw in the 70s or the 90s or anything. I don't think it came remotely close. But so I don't know. I don't even know. I could talk mumblecore a lot. I have it's an almost endless well, which is I just find interesting. But yeah.
All right. So with black and white film and black and white video, for me, I like the look of grain better on video when it was in black and white because it just reminded me of film grain more. Whereas video grain, when it's in color, it can kind of like tip itself like, oh, it's video, like obviously, just because it just doesn't have the same look as like film grain. So that was part of what attracted me to doing black and white video stuff. Also, the lighting was so much easier because you could use mixed lighting sources and it wasn't a problem. So I could use daylight plus incandescent plus whatever combination, and it all just like equates pretty similar. Like obviously there are minute differences in color temperature and how it responds with black and white, but overall you can just use whatever lighting you wanted. And I knew I wanted to use basically natural lighting, so it's kind of natural lighting's best friend, black and white, in a lot of ways, especially for video, because obviously if you're shooting with film, you're not necessarily seeing what you're capturing as you're capturing it, whereas with video I can do very minute underexposed stuff that still works and still looks great, because I can kind of watch and make sure that like anything I need to be properly exposed in the shot is being exposed, etc. And then to go into mumblecore, we're basically like dual topicking.
I know. Can I expand on what you just said before you go into mumblecore? Because I have a thing.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Well, so with Hectic Knife, what I shot that on the Panasonic DVX 100B, which was like I think the second or third in the line of the DVXs, and by that point they had really perfected a few things, and I really think that's like the key version of that camera too. But what I did, I had this sort of technique when I shot that. I turned the gain up all the way, for the whole shoot, no matter what we were doing. So we would be indoors and really well lit, and I still had the gain all the way up, and then I would just expose, I'd set the exposure accordingly so nothing was like overexposed. But I just mean the purpose of doing it that way was that way the grain would be totally natural to the camera and pushed and enhanced as like far as the camera can naturally do it. Because with the gain all the way up, if people don't know what gain means, basically like the like easy way to explain it is like if you were shooting like a friend's wedding in low light and you couldn't see like almost anything, there's a like little knob on the camera literally, and there has 3 different settings. And if you turn it all the way up, it's called gain. It'll bring in as much light as like possible to the image. So if you've ever seen like very grainy, video of like a wedding from 25 years ago, 20 years ago, that's the gain being like all the way up. It's like trying to fight to bring as much light into the sensor as it possibly can. So the grain in Hectic Knife and in Psycho 8 both, because I did this on both things, it's all like totally naturally like built into the shot. There's no like grain filters and all that stuff like put in later. It's all real. And I agree with you 1,000% with what you said, because when I dipped Hectic Knife to black and white and started making those adjustments, the grain looks like gorgeous in the natural DVX, like black and white, like turned black and white. And it's funny to me, but I've had a lot of people and like independently of one another ask me like if I shot Hectic on 16 or they assume that I did. And it's all thanks to the DVX and the way that grain gives it such like a texture. It really is like almost filmic, but it has its own kind of specific style. But what I will say is that Bad Brain, the movie that I shot last summer, I shot that on what is the new Panasonic. It's still the DVX, but it has a different name. I don't even know, the HVX or something like that.
I think it's the 200 DVX 200.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's right. DVX 200, and it's basically it's the DVX in 4K. Well, Bad Brain will most likely. I mean, I was thinking it's intended to be in color, and I did the same thing though. I turned the gain up all the way, thinking like this is gonna work. It'll give me the same kind of thing. And it's really not. It was probably a mistake to do it that way. However, I'm trying as hard as I can. What I'm sort of trying to do now in post with like the color timing and everything is like a naturalistic palette, but that does have some of that sort of like old school looking 16 millimeter kind of grain to it, but it's not quite the same. The 4K is just such a big image, and it's so like you see every like pore in the skin, which is something I like kind of love about the DVX is that you get this like crystal clear, nice image, but it was so small that it kind of like washed over some of that stuff. And so I'm actually struggling. Like I kind of did the same thing I'm used to doing that worked on the what's it called, the mini DV tape, a version of the the SD version of the DVX, and it's not quite translating in the 4K, and it's kind of bothering me. But oh well.
Yeah, that's what happened with television a little bit as well. Is like you got these shows that some of them were shot on 35 millimeter, and they were only ever meant to be seen in a standard def way. So you do different things as far as makeup than you would normally do, and then suddenly with the advent of DVD and Blu-ray, you're seeing these shows and you're seeing the makeup and you're seeing the special effects and too much resolution basically, and it's basically just the wrong effect because you're seeing every pore, like you said, you're seeing every wrinkle, and you're seeing all these things that you wouldn't normally have to see. So yeah, it is a funny thing with standard def and 1080p and 4K as far as filmmaking. I never shoot 4K when I shoot movies because I kind of like how 1080 is kind of my makeup person in a way. And if I was transitioning from standard def to 1080, I'd feel like more safe with standard def, and basically like whatever's the bigger, better so-called version of like what I'm trying to do. I feel like I would always want to do something just one step down, one step removed. I would want to use 4K instead of 8K if that were an option. Hiding the strings is such an important aspect, whether you're doing stuff with actual strings or metaphoric strings. And I just feel like there is, yeah, like you said, a kind of like quality where you can kind of cover up things and things just blend together a little bit better. That's why standard def and high def is just so relative. And I think when consumers talk about it, they don't really know what they're talking about. Basically, they just want a clear picture that just doesn't look compressed. And we're over here trying to have to worry about like the actual ramifications of shooting in particular ways, for sure.
Well, it's about intention too, right? Like, I mean, like, Psycho 8 being shot on mini DV tape in 2019 is totally like intentional in the sense that like we're making the clear statement like we don't care about like resolution lines and stuff. Like this is supposed to be sort of grimy and old school and like cheap look, like that's, and it's like for the cause, like that's what it's supposed to be. So if you could do the opposite. You could make Psycho even 70 millimeter or in like 16K or whatever that they have. And the joke could be the opposite. Like, look at how giant and expensive this dumb little small thing is. But for our purposes, that you sort of lean into the world that you're creating, and it's like what you have access to kind of helps like shape that. So it's like in that way, it's like Psycho kind of couldn't be any other way. It looks like it's supposed to be that size and shape and that low quality and all that stuff. And I think as long as you're sort of playing to that rather than like worrying about renting a camera that has the highest resolution and blah blah blah, because when you're caught up in all that stuff, you lose what it's all about. You lose kind of the rest of it, and I think a lot of times, like, people starting out making a short stuff, it's I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't strive for the look that you want or strive for like the highest possible, resolution or technical polish, or if that's what you want. But I just think that sometimes that's like the only thing that people care about, and I'm often like very interested in the idea, if you were to do the Coke or Pepsi challenge with this kind of stuff with like the regular consumer out in the world, like, yes, obviously there's a gigantic chasm of objective visual difference between like Psycho Ape and Avatar 2, but like, is there that much of a difference between like Psycho Ape and like Blair Witch or something, which is a movie that it was like accepted by the mainstream 25 years ago? So the point being that it's like what the masses or whoever it is, what the audience or whoever out there, the hypothetical audience, like what they will accept, versus what what we think that they care about when we chase the highest resolution. I just think like I don't really know the answer to that. I'd be curious. And I even have a little, I was talking about this with a friend. This is slightly, it's like some same topic but just a tiny tangent, but it made me think of this is I like, there's this whole like common thing in filmmaking and film school and all this kind of stuff that always says like sound is the most important thing. Like, make sure you have crystal clear sound and blah blah. And 99999 repeating times out of whatever the number, that's always true. Like, yes, of course. Like, and the reason that people are saying that is because, like, if the audience is like struggling to hear what the dialogue is, like, they will check out right away. But if a shot has like too much headroom or something, they might not notice it, or they might notice it, but if they can hear it, then that's okay. And I sort of like push back on that in the sense that I would say that, like, if you took like an objectively like bad looking amateur like film and like short film by some hypothetical no name person that like never made anything, and they just tried to make this short and it was like terrible and boring and didn't matter, if you took that thing and like did a bunch of ADR and sound design to it and like made it all amazing sounding, like, no one would say it was good. But if you took like 2001 Space Odyssey, or just like, some whatever, any big movie, like any real movie, and you like put like static and like grating noise like under the whole thing, like, which one would still be like better? Like, I think it's almost obvious. Like, it's like, I think like this focus on polish in certain areas are just like technical things that people get caught up in. I don't, I might be biased because all my stuff, like, people might say it looks and sounds like shit or something. You know what I mean? Like, maybe I'm just fighting for my own cause, I guess. But I don't know. I think there's a little bit of like artistic like merit or truth to what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, I think audiences are way savvier and way hipper than they ever get a chance to be. I think, things are usually so controlled and so calculated that they're delivered, when really, like, they just want stuff that's cool and interesting. It's kind of a thing where we as artists, we're kind of biased, and we're trained to think of audiences as squarer than us. But every weird decision I've ever made, as far as like something that like I would think that audiences wouldn't be into, but I like, as far as what I want to do with one of my movies, whether it's no shark, having no sound effects or music or anything, and just being straight monologue over footage, I put that out into the world, and people are down to like watch that, and it has its audience, and nobody's like, oh man, I can't watch that because it doesn't have any like, weird fucking sounds of waves or some shit. Everyone who is interested in it just goes along for the ride. So I think it's like I think we should think of ourselves more as like chefs, and like, how like chefs are like thought of as like these assholes, but like are so beloved as far as with society and stuff, and like will make these like grand artistic statements with their food and be very like tough on their people that are working for them, but also like, I don't care if like the public accepts us, but like, I'm just going to put out the food that I believe in, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm not saying we should be dicks to people that work for us, but I'm saying that like the boldness of a chef is so accepted by even the most square people that you could ever meet in your entire life. Like, people that just have no sense of what even art is. And if you think of film as like food, like something that nourishes you as well as entertains you and as well as like titillates you, it's one and the same. And we should understand that like if we see our audience as people that will go down that rabbit hole with us, then we can do pretty much anything we want. It's only when we think of ourselves as above our audience, and our audience is particularly below us, that our choices are going to be kind of like half-assed in a way, because they're going to come from a place of like cynicism. I feel like you can do anything as long as you believe that like some people will go along on the journey with you, versus thinking to yourself like, oh, I'm alone on this. Like if you just include the audience as far as like, hey, you're as cool as I am, I think they'll go on the journey.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think I'm a big sports analogy person, so I think I mean the chef thing works perfectly. But I mean, I think like when you're like a little kid and you try to throw a ball, like you don't really know how, but you might imitate like what you've seen someone like throw a ball. And some kids are kind of, whatever reason, naturally maybe better at doing the imitation than others. And then you're just naturally doing it as part of your life, but you're not really good at it until it's like a combination of things. You're not really good at it until you like actually interface it with like other people that are throwing a ball, and we can actually see what's going on. But you also have to like believe within yourself. And that's like the part that I think people maybe don't talk about as much. But like when you, the analogy I'll make with like making films or doing any kind of art is like, I started making stuff, like just making different films and little things and editing things and making music videos and shorts and full movies when I was like 14. And it felt like the first time you ever throw a ball. Like you don't know how to do it. Like you're just learning how to like move footage around in a timeline as a young 14-year-old, and how to like put a camera on a tripod and point it at something and look and see what you want it to be and stuff. And it's like, it kind of starts off almost as like nothing, like throwing a ball that it barely like leaves your hand. It's like, it's just like footage of your backyard. It's not anything. And then you start like putting it together, and there's these little tiny like victories, and then it keeps like progressing if you keep nurturing it and stuff, to the point where like you make a thing, but it's still like, it's like not good, but you like keep doing it because you feel like this is gonna be good like at some point. And then there's this point in your life of making stuff where, and for me, I will say it took it, I mean, I'm trying to think, I took at least 10 years, but I didn't feel like good making stuff, or good throwing a ball until like my mid-20s, like so 10 years later. And I probably didn't feel, I feel much more confident like now doing it. But the point I'm sort of getting to relate to like what you're saying about the chef just like serving the food is sort of that it's like there, I know for me there's a internal conflict like all the time, and the conflict is between, there's a hypothetical audience in my mind that I am like so desperate to please that it like cripples me emotionally sometimes. Like it is so, I feel like I'm doing everything for them. Like I'm I'm gonna, they talk about killing babies in your work, like, cutting stuff you love and all that. Like, I'm so ready to just totally like destroy my own piece of work for the sake of that audience, because I'm so obsessed with them, it making sense to them and resonating and all that stuff. But at the same time, there's an ironic thing where it's sort of like there's this ego part of it where it's like, but they're gonna get what like a good example for me is in Bad Brain. I did these like people on the street interviews, which you were part of course. And people will ask me like, how is that going to go in the film? Like, where is that? What is that for, or whatever? And the truthful answer is like, they're going to go throughout the film, but like, I don't exactly know. Like, when I say I don't know, I mean like, this makes sense to me. That's why I'm doing it. It makes more sense to me to do it than to not do it. And I trust, my ego is telling me that if I just do that the way I know how, it's going to make sense to the end user at the end. But it's all like a fake magic trick. Like, I don't really know what I'm doing. It's all a sleight of hand until I do put it together. And then it's like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. Like, you can just make a film that's a narrative that just cuts to like strangers in Times Square, like answering questions. Like, you can do that. And it's like, it's an ego decision of like, no, this is the food that I'm making, like, no matter whether you like it or not. But it's like, I have to trust that it's like gonna taste good and stuff. And I like to, it took 10 or 20 years to like trust myself, but I do now. And I'm at a point now where I'm like, okay, like I know how to make this meal. Like, let me make it, leave me alone and let me make it. And it's really hard to do, but like, you're gonna like it basically. It sounds egotistical to say and stuff, but it's like, you wouldn't be able to do it if like you didn't feel that way, I guess. And so I think that's what you're saying to some extent, and I get that a lot.
Yeah, I think that's the way to approach it, is to kind of like trust yourself as almost like a conduit for something greater than yourself. Like, almost in like the classic, almost biblical sense of like, yes, I have the voice of God talking to me. I'm not going to like second guess it. Like,
Totally.
I hear it, and just listen to me, because trust me, I'm right about this.
Well, the best thing I ever heard about this idea was Dave Chappelle in his episode of Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And he's talking about what it feels like to like make art and work on stuff, and versus like having an idea. And he's basically saying like, sometimes an idea pulls up in front of my house in a car, and it's like, come on, get in the car, honking the horn, like, come on, dude, you're coming with me, like, get in the car, we're gonna go. And then he gets in the car, and the idea is just driving the car, and he's like, all right, like, it would go this way, but and then all of a sudden, like, kind of, he figures it out, and then that's the creation comes from that, and it's usually like the best thing ever. But when there's times in his life where he's like, I should drive somewhere, like, I'm gonna do it, I'll drive the car, and then he tries to get in, and he's trying to drive, but there's no idea in the car. And that's the ego part, being like, I'm the guy. It's always like both things. It's like, if you think that you're always the God that has all the ideas, then you might be driving this like empty car around. But when the idea is driving you, then I think you, Cody, just said is true. You're the idea is like the God thing, and you've become Jesus or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it is that conduit that you said. Like, there's this spiritual thing that's like the driving the car, and if you're lucky enough to be in the car with it, then you have this little bit of godly, fairy dust. I mean, I should say I'm an atheist, so I'm speaking in figurative language, I guess. But I feel that there is real feelings of this, like, ideas can just like carry you somewhere that you didn't. It doesn't feel almost like you had the idea. It just feels like it somehow, wow, that came into my head, that is awesome, like, that makes me laugh, and that makes me excited, and I gotta go write that down right now. And like that, that's a great feeling. But then we've all had those times too where we kind of got nothing, but we're like, I should write, so I could do something, and it's like, sometimes that's a great attitude. You force yourself into putting yourself in that headspace, and sometimes you come out of it just looking like a jackass that doesn't have an idea. It's a kind of, It's all that stuff. Like you have to, when you're talking to God, you have to be like humble enough to talk to him, like, and respect the authority, but you also kind of have to be confident enough to get his respect, so he'll toss you an idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think showing up is something that Stephen Pressfield talks about a lot. He wrote the book The War of Art, which kind of goes into his ideas about the muse and the muse respecting you if you show up. If you sit down to write every day, the muse is going to take notice and the muse is going to come through your fingers in some capacity. But it's that diligence that tells the universe like that you're ready for those ideas. You know, Dave Chappelle, you know, he went up on stage so many times, very, very young. And that's kind of sends a beacon to the universe as far as the muse of like, give me some ideas. I'll be your vessel. I'll be a way for you to get those ideas out to the world and get that humor out. You know, that's the humbleness, I think, is you know, you're making yourself available to have ideas. And I can always tell the ideas that are coming through somebody versus the ideas that are coming from somebody. Because I'll have people I know who will be like, I have this great idea for a movie, and they'll tell me it, and it's just like I can tell it's almost like an imitation of an idea. It's like they're doing what they're saying what they think like an idea actually is. When I hear somebody tell me like an idea that they truly had, like that truly came to them and has nothing to do with their brain, is just something that just channeled through them, it just takes on a different flavor and it takes on this different aspect to the point where it's almost, there's an embarrassing quality to it because it shouldn't fully make sense. Like if somebody tells me like an idea that totally makes sense, I get a little wary of it because that's kind of not what ideas are like when they come through you. They have to have some aspect to them that's like wrong or stupid for them to be believable to me. And like, I think it's that way in like, it's like if you've suddenly found out you were pregnant, I feel like that's kind of more like what an idea truly is like, if like a friend sits you down and is like, hey, I just found out I'm pregnant. That's really what an idea is like. Not literally, but like it's, hey, there's this thing growing inside of me. I don't know what I'm going to do about it. If I'm going to pursue it or if I'm going to get rid of it and just move on. That's really what an idea is like. And when the muse kind of like shows up in your life with like, here's the movie we're going to make. You say you make movies, so here's a movie, and hope you're ready for it.
Well, I think the reason that the pregnant thing is such a great analogy is because there's so few good humans that like exist in the world of 8 billion of us, you know? But the great humans, it's almost like the number of great humans is like equating a ratio to like the number of like great films versus like all the ideas anyone ever had for one ever. Like it's like, you know, and like if you suddenly find out you're pregnant, like, yeah, a lot of people like end up raising a kid and then it's like some jerk person, like, but there's like so few people that are able to like nurture it into like this awesome person. And it's like, those are the, you know, like that's the movie Rocky or something, you know what I mean? It's just like, that's like these cool movies that exist. There's like when someone had the like means and the foresight and the ingenuity and the creativity and the guts and the fear and they had all the right things to like nurture the ideas that were coming through. Which, yeah, I think that's like a great way to put it.
Yeah, it's like a cross between nature and nurture, like the best of nature and the best of nurture coming together, and then you have Rocky, or then you have Star Wars or Jaws or whatever.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that you at one point you said something to the effect of like, I can kind of tell, like, and suss out, I can spot the sort of like not good ideas or whatever. And I don't remember exactly how you put it, but it made me think of sort of, and this is obviously my own personal feeling, but I think I suspect that there are people out there that might be able to understand or relate to what I'm saying, is that to me, part of the difference between like a Tarantino and a J.J. Abrams, who I would say a lot of people would say that are both these sort of like copy and paste, like homage, like paint by numbers kind of filmmakers, where Like like with Tarantino, it's like a very specific thing that we all now know, where it's literally like pretty much every single scene, or even down to a shot, or even down to like a tiny detail, is like something that's like lifted from another film and then like kind of rap sampled like into his film, and that's like how it works. But what comes out at the other end always feels so original that we almost like forget that these influences even happen, to the extent that, like, especially if you first understood him when you were a kid, you didn't have like I did, and you didn't have like a lot of reference for all this stuff, but it's like it felt so original that it was like mind-blowing. Like original, it felt so original, like how could this person have all these ideas? And you kind of realize like, oh, he in a way didn't. He's really great at collage. But I first of all don't say that to like say anything negative about him remotely. It's just a description that would be fair if posited about how the work is, in a way. With J.J. Abrams, it's not any different. It's just that for whatever reason, there's something hollow about the new creation, where it looks as beautiful and like amazing as it's like the thing that it's copying, but it somehow doesn't resonate and it doesn't have an originality to it when it's all put together. That to me always felt like some kind of the difference. I think in part of in what you're talking about is that it's sort of like some people have a knack for, when they're the conduit to these kind of ideas, to like swirl them into something that no matter how copied and no matter how much we can like see the parts inside, it feels like their idea and their voice. And some people, it's like almost the opposite. They swirl it together and all you see is just like all the parts, and it's like not, it doesn't even feel like a new thing at all. And it almost feels like, corny for that reason.
Yeah, it's like basically it's the difference between rescuing all these things that would have been forgotten in cinema. Because like a lot of Tarantino stuff, he'll lift from movies that are like barely good, but he'll pinpoint like the one or two things that are like really good in them, and he'll reference that or whatever. I think if you're humble in the sense that like your mission is to rescue these techniques and these motifs from film, and kind of show that like, no, we can use these kind of things to make something great, versus J.J. Abrams, who I think he wants to harken back to something that is probably a little overdone and a little bit covered territory, because J.J. Abrams is more of like I want to be like Spielberg randomly, or I want to be like whatever. And I like some stuff that J.J. Abrams has done. I think the show Lost is great, and I think his contributions to it were great. But, as a filmmaker, I just don't really see what the value is in what he's doing, because it feels like he's trying to do something, whereas Tarantino, I think his grammar and how he speaks is in clip form, almost like if you were a hip hop artist, you would think in terms of samples, and you would think in terms of like, I got to grab this bit from this song here and this bit from this other song, etc. And if I put it all together, it's going to be like the best new song of the summer or whatever. That's Tarantino to me. A friend of mine, I'm blanking on who it was, said to me that my friend Lunch, who's a record producer and he does beats and everything. He said that he considers Tarantino to be the first hip hop filmmaker. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think you can sample so much that it becomes a new art form. And I think that's what Tarantino cracked that some other people haven't been able to crack.
I think he embraced it openly too and talks about it. I mean, I've heard him talk about that, and I think what's interesting for Tarantino is that right after Reservoir Dogs was a hit, so at his first film, you already had people who were savvy enough who were like, wait, like, but all this stuff is like from other movies. And then they would start to show like, here's a side by side, like here's what happened in Reservoir Dogs, here's what happened in this other movie that he's like lifting, some, whether it's some Japanese movie or some other, whatever it is. And so I think I don't think Tarantino's wrong in saying it at all. And I agree with him, but I think that it almost started as a defense. That it was sort of like, look, I'm doing this in the way that hip hop does. And it's sort of a defense line against people that might have been accusing him of like lifting stuff or being too much of a collage guy and stuff. I also want to say that, like, while I don't necessarily find much of J.J. Abrams' work, I never saw Lost, but I never, I don't find his work. It doesn't really resonate with me on a like very deep level. I think he's super talented, and I don't like. I'm not, it's like I'm sort of not like I'm not trying to be against him or anything. And it's like no disrespect. He did. Is that movie called, what is it called? Gone Fishing. Do you remember that movie with like Joe Pesci and like Danny Glover?
Yeah, I do remember that. I didn't know he had.
He wrote that movie. I remember.
Really?
I remember watching. I remember like it was one of those movies that like the previews were on like all day long when I was like a 10-year-old kid, and I never saw it, but it was like such a big part of my life through the previews on TV. And I finally watched it as an adult, and it's like terrible. It doesn't matter at all. But it was one of those things where it was like, wait, written who? Like what? Written by J.J. Abrams. He actually wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of scripts like before he was known.
Yeah, he did. He wrote Forever Young, which is a really good Mel Gibson movie.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, he's written some good stuff. I think he co-wrote Joyride, which I think is one of the best early 2000s horror movies.
Definitely.
That's a fantastic movie.
I remember I heard Tarantino say that very early in his career, maybe like after Pulp Fiction or something, he was looking for a project. And he read a really great script that came across his desk for Speed Racer, and it was J.J. Abrams' script. And this predates, the Wachowski sisters and all that. So this predates all that by a lot.
Yeah, so I think he's a very talented writer. Clearly, I think his transition into directing has been a little bit weird for me to watch. And I think he's been pretty good as a producer as well. He's produced some movies that I really like. I like Cloverfield, the first one, a lot.
Yeah,
I think it's as far as like capturing a zeitgeist, man, that movie nailed the blackout in New York City, which a lot of people forget about, which happened after 9/11 and kind of.
Was that 2003? Because I lived in Detroit and I went through the blackout too. It was the entire like Canada and like upper Midwest and East Coast, like North. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and that movie really nailed that. That was, I believe, 2006, but maybe I'm wrong.
It sounds right. I mean, it was also 9/11. I mean, it's after 9/11. It's after the blackout, and it's also this like. Because I think what happened partially at 9/11 was we also had all this like consumer video of it. And it's kind of one of the first like real things that happened where that was a big deal. And I think Cloverfield did a good job of like using the sort of Blair Witch established, but not like the first time that's ever been done, but using the Blair Witch established like found footage style to like combine it with this like New York City disaster. And the blackout and 9/11 and that movie at that time, it all like sort of came together perfectly. It was like the perfect movie for that period.
Yeah, it totally understood something. I think it spoke to something a little bit unspoken. So I want to, now that we're talking about that time period again, I want to circle back to the mumblecore thing that you were addressing, because that is something I think about a lot. Like there were a lot of people just in my periphery when I was budding as a filmmaker that have gone on to like huge stuff. And as far as like, I'm talking about comedians, I'm talking about filmmakers, I'm talking about, it was a really exciting time when we were just starting making movies here in Brooklyn. And some of it, I kind of, because I saw that territory was being conquered in a certain area, I wanted to go a completely different direction. So like when I talked to Joe Swanberg on this podcast, I explained to him that like a lot of that mumblecore stuff, I consciously avoided as much as possible when I was making my first movies, because I didn't want to be influenced by it. I wanted to do something that was unique. I saw it as like, all right, well, whatever they're doing as far as like the shaky cameras and all that, like, and the basically the style of that, like I wanted to do like with Shredder, with my first film, I just wanted to lock the camera down, treat it like it weighed like 100 pounds and just go in a different direction. And like, obviously later in life, when I watch a lot of those mumblecore movies for the first time, I can totally see like the similarities between my stuff and what they're doing, even though I'm approaching it in a slightly different way. I think there was something in the air back then that was just seeping into everything. But basically, Joe told me that, like, hey, man, if I was in your exact same shoes, I would have been doing the exact same thing. I would have avoided it as much as possible. I would have avoided it like the plague, essentially, and just done my own thing. So I think there was, as much as we can kind of regret, like, man, I wish I had, networked a bit more, or I wish I'd known more people or put myself out there. I think some of our best work probably wouldn't have been done if we didn't differentiate ourselves at the time.
I totally agree with that. It's funny. That's all really interesting. It's funny. You and I have one thing in common, is that Swanberg has bought like work from each of us. Like
Yeah.
he bought Kill the Lion Manifesto, right? And he bought a copy of Psycho Ape on VHS, and has been a big supporter and stuff. And no, I think that's all interesting, because I remember early on, and this might have been like literally after Shredder, so we're talking like 2009 or 10. I remember telling you that, hey, there's this mumblecore thing, like your stuff really seems to fit into that and feel that way. And at the time, you were really like not having, you were like, no, like you're very kind of against it. And I always kind of remembered that. And it's funny because, again, shout out to my friend John, who's an actor who's in Bad Brain and in a million things. Awesome guy. He's a fan of one of your films that, I think he watched Ramekin, and but I showed it to him and stuff. And we've talked about this stuff before. And he knows mumblecore up and down, has seen everything. It's like incredible. He's like gone into every little nook and cranny of this like scene. And when I was showing him your stuff, he's like, yeah, this like totally fits into like what the mumblecore thing would be. And I was sort of even telling him, yeah, but at the time, like he was like not a part of that. And I certainly wasn't either. We were sort of both in the same boat, being outside, kind of this whole thing that was happening. And it's interesting to me to hear, like, that you were able to, that you've looked back on some of the stuff and noticed like that thing. I mean, I do think that your work like fits very, I say that this is all a huge compliment. I mean, but I say it, I think it fits into that movement, or would fit into it very well. And I remember even it being interesting to me when Swanberg had made that connection with you, because it was a few years ago when he bought your book and stuff, and you eventually talked to him. Just because, again, I just remember back like your attitude of being so diametrically opposed to it, and then here it is, like Swanberg is kind of like literally like maybe the guy of the whole entire movement. I mean, definitely on the Mount Rushmore of it. And if you guys have become pals and stuff, I mean, it's amazing, it's cool. But I think that's cool what he said, that he would feel the same way. It's all interesting. But yeah, I think about that time a lot, for sure.
Yeah, basically, I went back and I watched a lot of his stuff, a lot of other people's stuff. Not that I liked all of it, but I found myself really connecting to a lot of his films in particular, and some other filmmakers as well. I really liked Aaron Katz's first couple films a lot. I liked Frank V. Ross's films. So I found stuff that I connected with within that movement, if you want to call it that. And especially like some of the Bujalski stuff. I really like that as well. Like what people say is like the first mumblecore movie, funny haha or whatever. In retrospect, I see the things that I'm doing and the things that they're doing in the crossover. I still think that like what they were doing was a little bit insular, and I think that was the thing that kind of threw people off, in that like it felt like a company of players in a certain sense, because like Greta Gerwig's in a bunch of them and certain people pop up, so it felt like almost in like the Cassavetes sense, that it felt like a group that constantly comes back together, and that can feel like you can't even penetrate it, like, because like, well, where would I fit in? I'd just be like the new guy,
My theory is this, and I want to make very clear, because I'm actually saying this like out loud on a thing now. I feel kind of weird, but my theory is this. And I don't know. I mean, I've had like very brief correspondence with Joe. Obviously, you know Joe a little bit. My friend Kansas Bowling is friends with Joe, and like he's awesome. I'm being a little bit cautious here. I don't know any of these people personally at all, so this is like totally guy who is me, and that's like, it's just, this is my own little theory. But I always felt like after 9/11, New York became the cool city in the country again. Seattle had been holding that throne, and it seemed like it was just going to keep holding. Even after grunge had become corny and the scene was like dying by the year 2000, like Seattle was still like the cool city. And Austin sometimes would always like try to make a little, gambit for it. Detroit, like, pathetically always tried, but it never like worked really. It's like way too like, it's just like way too like depressed. But New York, once 9/11 happened, it's like, oh, okay, this is like gonna be the cool, like, we're gonna go back to Brooklyn. This is like where it's gonna like, there was a thing in the air of that. And then I think what you have happen is, and this is where I'm like really hesitant to say it because I don't want to sound like a jerk, and I also like it's I don't know these people personally, so I'm trying to like be clear about this, but like in any movement, it's like mostly like rich kids, right? Like it's rich kids that can afford to like go live in Williamsburg and gentrify it and like get all this gear and do all this stuff. Like it's there's a air of that. And mumblecore, again, it's like, I'm not pointing a finger at like any specific person, but it's sort of like you combine those things. And I think when you start talking about like a clickiness or just like there being gates up or like it feeling like these are kind of the cool theater kids in a way, like I think there is a little bit of like I know that I don't know if you've come around. I know you don't like Lena Dunham's work or something, but like one thing I was almost kind of like, I like her. I'm a fan of her. I like girls and I like Tiny Furniture. One thing that I was always like kind of raise an eyebrow or was a little bit like, hey dude, what like, why are you doing this? Like about girls, was that Lena Dunham, the real person, is like a rich girl from Manhattan that has like artist parents. And so of course she was like able to do all this stuff. But the character in Girls is from Michigan, like specifically almost like where I'm from. And the whole thing is that she's very like entitled about like, oh, my parents like pay for me to like live in Brooklyn and I'm trying to be like a writer and all this stuff. And it felt like this girl from Manhattan that was like already rich and had like connected parents was like criticizing people like me that were like literally coming from the place in her show and like trying to kind of make it as an artist, like out there and struggling and stuff. And again, I'm not, my point in saying all this is like, yes, it felt like I'm sure there is in any artistic movement throughout history. It's sort of like, it looks like it's coming from the streets because everything is handheld and everything is like digital and everything is these young people and they're probably poor in their little tiny Brooklyn apartments and stuff. But it's also like half of those people are, they're like rich kids that can like afford to like slum it because they have like it's that kind of situation. And I think like a lot of those people, it's like, of course they're going to sort of climb show business in a way that the rest of us aren't because they're already kind of connected and this is just them in kind of like boot camp or something. But I don't know. I as I hear myself say all that stuff, I don't even know how it sounds, and it's kind of like dumb, but I don't know.
No, I think you're picking up on something that's real, which is there's a documentary I watched recently, which was pretty good. It could have been way more comprehensive, but I liked it, which is called Meet Me in the Bathroom, which is a kind of about like the Strokes and the Moldy Peaches and that kind of like burgeoning Brooklyn music scene after 2001. And it doesn't address these things like head on, but like everything you're talking about is pretty much true, which is it gets into the criticisms of the Strokes at the time, which is these are all kind of rich kids and these are all are kids that would have been fine without being in the band The Strokes just because of their lineage and their parents and stuff. And that's the same thing with every person who was on Girls. Like these girls would be fine. If you're Brian Williams' daughter, you're going to be fine. You know, these kind of things where like when we make art, when you or I make art and you're sleeping in a living room for years, cranking out stuff on YouTube for like your friend and stuff, or like if I'm rubbing two sticks together to make a movie, if I'm making a movie for $0 or $500 or whatever, you know, there's always the the tightrope aspect of it, where like we could fall and there's no net, and for a lot of people there is a net. And I feel like at the time, if I felt like somebody had a net, I kind of just wanted to be away from them, because it just didn't feel right. It felt like something was fishy. I always equate it to, true Brooklynites versus transplants, but there's a lot of people that came to Brooklyn that are totally cool, much like yourself. I think it's more like just
you're allowed to have your own Brooklyn cred. I accept that. I'll always be a Midwest kid, but yes, I accept that.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between a transplant who can fuck up as much as they want and nothing will ever happen to them, and a transplant who could end up, right back home if they don't get their shit together or something.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think that's probably what I was picking up on, whether I could have explained it at the time, but like, I just, if I feel like somebody is going to be all right, like if I'm playing with like real ammo and they're playing with like fucking Nerf ammo, and they're acting like we're both playing like with the same shit, like I'm just like, what the fuck? Like,
dude, 100%. I mean, I want to make clear too, like, there's nothing inherent, like, first of all, a kid, we're talking about a kid is a kid, right? I mean, a kid didn't ask to be born. A kid didn't, it's not their like fault or anything. And beyond that, it's undeniable that there's tons of really talented artists that came from these places. And I mean, first of all, it's like, of course, because if you grow up around these people, then it's nature nurture. Like, it's very obvious that that's also going to happen. And I think we certainly like to, that whole like Nepo baby thing came out like a few months ago. I mean, we certainly love to celebrate when, the son or daughter or whoever of a rich person is like trying to be in show business and they suck and they're not funny or they're not good. Like we always celebrate that failure. And I totally understand it. I get it.
I'll be the first to say, by the way, Funny Pages, which Owen Klein made, that's probably the best movie I saw last year. And that couldn't be more Nepo baby, but I think talent kind of seeps through. I like the Strokes. I like their early stuff a lot.
Sure.
I think rich kids can make good stuff. I think that was my review when I watched Funny Pages and I did it on Letterboxd. I was like, sometimes spoiled rich kids make really good art. It happens. And
no, of course. I think the deeper thing is that, when I was younger, and I think you touched on this too, but and when I was younger, I didn't think of any of this stuff. I also, in a very naive way, for me personally, I just thought everything was based purely on like artistic merit and like, your talent and all that kind of stuff, what you're bringing in that way. So I did, the only thing I knew how to do in response to thinking that was to just keep practicing constantly and trying to push myself to be the best, like filmmaker, writer, all that stuff that I could possibly be. But, I will say that doing that alone in a vacuum, it's not the easy. It's not easy. It's really hard. It's really, really hard to do. And when you're having to do that and then also getting, like you mentioned, like most of the time that we were making Hectic Knife, like, I was living in a living room. Like, I currently live in a garage. Like, it's not, and I'm very, very extremely, extremely grateful to have that situation. So it's not, but the point in saying that is that, like, there's so many people that I've met out here or anywhere, and it's not their fault at all. And they are extremely talented, and I'm literally not pointing a single finger at like any one person, because it's just sort of like the general experience of meeting all these different kinds of people as I get older. If you have never been in a situation where you're like living in a living room or whatever like that, it's like impossible to sort of relate to it or to like understand what it is and understand like the barriers that you feel like you have. Like when you're just trying to survive and get through, the next couple months and all that kind of stuff, it's like, when that's what your life is, then it's like so much harder to like try to like make a good movie and all that kind of stuff. And like, I know for me personally, I've sort of, I've always sort of like designed a life that kept me in poverty because ironically so being being in poverty was like the only way that I would be able to have like the free time and the freedom to like go make films. Like I guess this is like a weird thing to say, I guess, but it's like if you think about it, like between Bad Brain and Psycho Ape 2, like as we're talking right now, that's brought in like over $20,000 of like cash, to like make those films, right? Well, like $20,000 would like change my life. Like I'm in all this like personal debt and like you know what I'm saying? Like it's like that's like it would do all these big things, but I live a life where I would rather only have like a couple $100 to myself at the end of the month to like get groceries and then take that $20,000 and like spend it on making films. Like that's sort of the constant like negotiation that you're like making with yourself. And there is literally no chance that someone that has a giant trust fund or whatever they have, it's not possible for them to ever relate to any of that stuff. And the unfortunate thing that I've sort of learned is that like that life experience and all that stuff, like, yeah, it could add character to you as a person. It could add, in like, it could give you adversity that could help you a lot, like as a person, but it doesn't necessarily make you any more, talented or anything than like the next person. Like there's always going to be like a rich, handsome kid that can like throw the ball like farther than you. Like it's just sort of always going to be a thing. And you have to, I think that what I've learned as I got older is that you just basically have to remember that it's like it's your own self-expression. Like that's what it is. It's not about, there is no real competition. And like, as long as you try to interface the world like honestly, then like you should get something good out of it and try to make stuff. Like all the noise of like, oh, the rich kid had no idea how easy it is and they're trying to do it. It's like, yeah, and they're also making great films. I mean we've talked about this a little bit before. Like Buffalo 66 is like the best movie ever made, and it's like that's a total, like, he's a super rich kid. Like that's Vincent Gallo. Like he's the epitome of that. But it's like he's insanely talented, and he seems to be a genuine weirdo and a genuine interesting artist in person. Like it doesn't take away anything. Like that's the thing. And if you have the mindset that you're like competing with that, it's like, how could you ever win? Like not only did he make the best movie ever made, but he's also like always going to have more money. So like, what are you supposed to do? Like there is nothing that you can do. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think if you're playing against yourself, you're playing the game properly. If you're playing against other people, like you're going to be the worst golfer on the course because we're playing a game against ourselves. Ultimately, that's what art is. The only competition is like, can I be more myself next time? Can I be truer to my vision and what am I doing and do I like it? And if other people respond to it, great, whatever. But like ultimately, you're just trying to be the best you that you can be, whether you have $1 million or you have $1. Like you just want to be the best artist that you can be with what you have, for sure. All right, Greg, if you've heard the show before, which I don't even know if you have you even heard this show before?
I've heard the show. I mean, I certainly listened to the Swanberg one. I haven't listened to the one with Addison yet, but hi, Addison.
All right. So if you have heard the show before, you know that we do stupid questions here. We also have another segment, which I just introduced recently, which is where I prescribe a movie for somebody. I be video store guy. That's.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So what are you in the mood for right now? Before we get to stupid questions, what would you want to watch right now? And I'll try and think of a movie you haven't seen that kind of fits that.
Oh, my God.
Are you in the mood for something funny? Are you in the mood for something touching? What are you in the mood for?
Touching.
Okay. Tragedy?
No, not a tragedy. Like a touching comedy though. Not like a crazy comedy. Like a touching one.
Okay, I might hit some that you've seen already, just because you've seen everything and I've seen everything.
Yes.
Have you seen Things Change?
No.
You never saw that, the David Mamet?
No.
Oh my God, you would actually really like that movie. I would have pegged that as one that you've seen and liked.
So wait, are you saying that David Mamet made a tame, touching comedy that's not like insane, like swearing and nut stuff? I mean, I love him, but is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. He wrote it with Shel Silverstein, and he directed it.
Really? Shel Silverstein?
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's Joe Mantegna and Don Amici are these two. Joe Mantegna is a gangster, and Don Amici looks like a gangster. He's like the splitting image of this gangster. And it's about Joe Mantegna and the splitting image of a gangster basically going to Vegas and doing stuff together. It's fantastic. It's so up your alley. It's so touching and so sweet and so funny. I think you'll really like it.
Yeah, I gotta watch that. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. It's I think it was made in the late 80s. And things change. If you're listening at home, you want to watch along with Greg.
Is that before or after House of Games then?
I believe it's after, yeah.
Wow. Weird. Okay. Well, yeah, man. That's cool.
Yeah, I think it was his second film, so right after House of Games.
Wow. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And now stupid questions. These are some stupid questions I have for you. Are you ready to be asked some stupid questions?
Yes.
All right. First stupid question. Do you ever wish your name was Craig and not Greg, or do you like Greg?
Fuck no. Can I swear?
Please do.
Dude, no. I mean, I already hate my name because it sucks. Because growing up in the era that we did, it's like every like corny asshole villain in the 80s movies was like named Greg, and it's just like it just doesn't even sound pleasing. Like it's just like a bad sounding word. But Craig is like way worse because it's like Craig is they've somehow found a way to take the sound of my name and make it like weaker, which is like, ugh. I apologize to all Craigs out there, but yeah, I can't. I would never want to change it. But I do sometimes consider. You ever see where they spell Greg with 2 G's for no reason? Like I kind of like that. I kind of like wish that's how my name was written, but it's not.
So you could use another G. You could use another $1,000.
I could.
All right. Next stupid question. How do you feel about the fact that Tarantino totally stole your Jaws as the first movie thing?
Wait, did he?
Yeah, I think I sent you this. He's been in his book and on his podcast. He's basically said that like Jaws is the first movie, basically.
I guess that is true. I read the book. I guess you're right. I did kind of pick up on that. Yeah.
That was your fucking thing for so long, and you got so much shit for it on the internet.
Yeah,
and now he runs with it, and everybody loves it.
It's funny that you say that because I will say that I have not looked at any of the articles that I wrote for Smug Film, and now it's like 10 years ago. And I'm terrified of them. I assume I would completely like cringe and stuff, and I hope that I've evolved quite a bit from my thinking from, that when I was that age and stuff. But I do think back on that particular essay a lot. I believe it was called The Idea of What a Movie Is. And I always thought first of all, I want to say I always thought it was like interesting, kind of cool in a way, that H-Bomber guy, Harry Brewis said, and I think I used this quote where he was basically like, because he's a big fan of Hectic Knife. And he said something to the effect of like, I can't believe someone like that has such like shitty opinions about movies, like made such a great one. And I think back on that. I think back on that podcast that I did with John D'Amico back in the day. I don't think I probably don't know how much I agree with myself from that period necessarily, but it is interesting, yes, that Tarantino seems to have like adopted that idea, if that's the case. And my initial reaction to it would be that, like most things in that way, I am either way ahead of the time or way behind the time, and I'm never quite dialed rightly. Because yeah, I remember getting a bunch of like hate for that, and just basically just being kind of like confused by it. And I will say, like, I haven't talked to John D'Amico since then. I wish him well. I don't know him personally. I don't know if he ever like became a filmmaker or anything, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know what he does now or what his like deal is. I almost feel like in that quote unquote debate that we had on the podcast, I probably basically agree with him now more than me at the time. but I sort of found him to just be like humorless and pretentious, where I was kind of just trying to be like, I don't know, I just like movies. I don't know, that question was actually not stupid. It actually opened up like a whole thing, just because I don't know. I guess you're right. I do remember reading that him saying that in Cinema Speculation, but it didn't quite set off the thing in my head that was like, oh yeah, I said that. I guess I did say. I don't know. I always thought maybe I said Rocky instead of Jaws. I don't know, but that's an interesting.
No, you said Jaws.
That's interesting. Well, I don't know. Hey, great minds, I guess, right? I don't know. Maybe he was secretly reading Smug Film the whole time. Who knows?
Honestly, he's so familiar with like small movie publications and random little small distributors and stuff like that. I would not be surprised if he saw that piece at some point, maybe 10 years ago, and it just rattled around in his head and came back when he was writing his book. Not plagiarism, of course, but just good ideas kind of stick in your head a little bit. I think you were onto something.
Well, shout out to myself, because it's not technically his podcast, but the Pure Cinema podcast did play a trailer that I edited recently. So yes, there's a maybe he's secretly like, hey, we gotta, everything this guy Greg does, we gotta get this out there somehow.
Dude, it's a smaller world than you will ever realize. I've had situations where like I by chance talked to like a filmmaker that I like, and they were like, oh yeah, I loved Ramekin. And it's because you don't necessarily hear from everybody once they see something, you know?
Right.
If you think about in your own life, I don't go emailing every single director that I watch a movie that I like of. And why should we expect anything else? So, you never know who is familiar with your shit basically in this world.
Yeah, man.
All right, next question. Did you know that if you dated Kathy Griffin in the mid-2000s and she liked being on top of you when you had sex, the name of her reality show back then would have been My Life on the DeLiso? Instead of My Life on the D-List.
Right. Oh, that's right. That story, that joke makes me think of Fred Stoller, who is a comedian that like nobody knows. And he was like on a Seinfeld episode as himself. And he is on he did an episode of Norm Macdonald's podcast, like the one from 10 years ago on YouTube. And he tries to tell this story about having sex with Kathy Griffin, but like he's just like, he's like insane. Like he can't like tell the story. And the whole time Norm is just kind of like trolling him because he's so like, you can't like say anything. So yes, that's my reaction to that, is that it makes me think of Fred Stoller being trolled by Norm on the old podcast.
It's a great clip. Hopefully people will listen to it.
Yeah.
All right, last stupid question, actually two-parter. I'm going to borrow the last questions you used to ask whenever you would interview anybody, which is, first question, what's your favorite movie?
Field of Dreams, baby.
And what's your least favorite movie?
The Dark Knight.
I really don't like The Dark Knight either, I gotta say. Some people know this about me, but not enough do.
Well, here are words that you definitely never would have expected to hear me say ever. I'm excited to see Oppenheimer. Basically just because I think that when Nolan is confined to like some form of reality and historical stuff, I don't mind his style as much anymore, and I'm just happen to be deeply interested in that story and the Manhattan Project and the nuclear bomb. All that stuff is just really interesting to me. So I don't really care how like boring it is. Like I'm probably just gonna like it because it's gonna be cool, and I'm excited for it. I also want to go on record as saying that I think Christopher Nolan is like super talented. I don't know anything about him personally. I wish him well. I do think he's like a true auteur and like awesome and stuff. I just personally don't really seem to like many of his movies. I break it down, a lot of it, to just like stylistic stuff. He kind of has like very rounded edges, and I tend to like things that are much more angular. So he just kind of wears on me, and I just find it kind of boring and like grating. But that's okay. 10 years ago, the younger me would have been like way more like spiky about all that stuff and blah, blah, blah and all this stuff. I really don't like The Dark Knight. I mean, I don't like any of those three Batman movies, really. The Dark Knight, I think, is the best of the three, like almost by far. It's the only one that I do think is like watchable, basically. I will say that Psycho Ape 2 is going to open with a parody of the opening of The Dark Knight, and that's exciting. But no, I've softened a lot. But yeah, no, but I am in a way, I'm not in a certain way. I'm not joking. I really don't like The Dark Knight, and I that movie really sort of like when it came out and everybody was obsessed with it. I felt kind of like crushed in a way.
Yeah, when I remember hearing that like Heat was like a really big influence on The Dark Knight, and I was like, yeah, and I don't like that one either. So I don't like either of those, and that perfectly lines up for me. All right, Greg, it was great talking to you. I hope you watch Things Change, and I can't wait to see Bad Brain and Psycho Ape 2.
Yeah, man. Love you, man. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Love you too. Talk to you soon.
Yep. Later.
Thank you all for listening, and if you like the show, contribute $2 per month, killthelinefilms.com. That's all we ask, $2. It keeps the show afloat, it keeps the studio afloat. We want to make more movies, more podcasts for you. Thank you all for listening. See you soon.